good old video game consoles. Literally, they're old and they're good, I'd say. But besides being good, some of these consoles are also really important, which, funny enough, can sometimes be mutually exclusive from good. Yep, just because something is important doesn't mean it's also good or fun. Getting out of bed in the morning sucks. Also, just because something is good, that doesn't necessarily translate one-to-one with being important. So, as much as people love the Super Nintendo, myself included, you won't be seeing it on this list, and that's not to say the Super Nintendo isn't really good, just that it didn't impact the gaming industry as much as some other consoles did. The key word here is impact, and while coming along and being an awesome console that people still love to this day is certainly an impact in its own right, I'm not just gonna pick the 5 consoles that I think people enjoy the most. I get it, the Super Nintendo is a great console, I'm with ya, but I'm looking for home consoles that one could say changed the course of gaming's history. Okay, so if we're talking about home consoles and changing the course of gaming's history, how about the one that started this history by being the first commercially available home game console? That's right, the PlayStation 4. Nothing came before that. No! There was something before it? I must have got some bad information from the little neighbor kid down the street. It was the Magnavox Odyssey. Now we're talking. That looks appropriately old and crusty, and yet it's a staple in everybody's gaming collection nowadays, right? Well, maybe not. Yeah, I can't seem to find one amongst my consoles either. But some consoles are really important despite not having a ton of people who still care about them today. Although there are still some, kinda like the Atari 2600, which was the king of the home video game market for long enough that it has to be considered important. And yet, I'm going to be focusing on other consoles for this video, simply because I don't own those other two, but they still deserve recognition. So I tell you what, at the end of the video, I'll say where I think they rank among my top 5. So I guess you could say this is more like a top 7. Okay, so at number 5, for now, I have the Sega Genesis. The power of marketing and narrative. Something that companies have recognized the importance of, with narrative often dictating how well consoles will do. Just ask the Xbox One and its reputation for being announced with DRM, or the PS3 and its reputation for being launched at $5.99 that gave it such a rough start, or the Wii U and its reputation for not having a reputation as a console because so many people didn't even know it existed. Before the Genesis came along, the home game console market was typically just dominated by a single company, at least in the US. First it was Atari before the big crash, and then it was Nintendo for a while. But Sega said, hey, why not somebody else, like us? Sega showed that the gaming market didn't have to be dominated by a single company. There was room for more than one. Sure, you had instances like the PC Engine selling well, but that was only in Japan, whereas the Genesis managed to make a dent in the market share on a more global scale. Although, ironically, it didn't sell great in Japan. But ever since the Genesis, there's been 2 or more horses in the race at pretty much all times. Heck, after the Genesis started having its initial success, companies thought there was enough room for every horse to be in the race. But nope, just 2 or 3. And a culture of branding and positioning your console based on what the competitor would do has been established ever since. Except for Nintendo, who just does whatever they want. Sure, Sega was probably more aggressive than any company to follow, but they kind of needed to be. Nintendo ruled with an iron fist, setting up an ecosystem where developers, publishers, retailers, Timmy from school's mom, all had allegiances to them, some more forced than others, with the idea being to create a nice, safe video game market where a certain level of quality could be guaranteed in order to avoid another crash like the industry suffered in 1983. So, cracking into the market was about more than just trying to win over customers with edgy commercials that had the Sega scream and told you Nintendo sucked, that was only half the battle. It was also about things like convincing retailers to simply put your darned console on their shelves so that it even had a chance to sell. Proving to retailers that consoles from more than one company was a viable business strategy changed the entire way the video game ecosystem operated. And competition among gaming companies tends to benefit us, the gamers. For example, the Donkey Kong Country games are rumored to have been a competitive response to the Aladdin game on Genesis. Would we not have the Donkey Kong Country games if it weren't for the Genesis? It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely helped move that along as a competitive response. And speaking of things we still can't say for sure, did Sega get to Timmy? Did Timmy get to Timmy's mom? Or perhaps Sega got to Timmy's mom? Something we may never know. A lot of people like to say that Sonic was the reason why Sega was competitive with Nintendo, but really he was just symbolic of a larger strategy at play by Sega, which was by design, by the way. I mean, that's how a mascot works. Now, I should mention that even though a large portion of the Genesis's popularity came from North America, in fact, you could say all of its popularity came from North America if you're in the mood for, well, actually, and talk about how it's called the Mega Drive in other parts of the world, but it did still sell well in Europe, and North America is still a huge market even on its own. Plus, it undeniably influenced how the gaming industry would operate on a global scale moving forward. It also started the whole just market your console as the cool console for older kids and adults trend that worked so well for Sony and their PlayStation. Okay, the next console I have on my list might come as a bit of a shocker, and that would be the original Xbox. And to steal the words right out of your mouth, yeah, I loved brute force just as much as the next person, but come on, the Xbox? Well, it comes down to Xbox Live. I think Xbox Live is what really got online gaming for consoles off the ground. Sure, online gaming on consoles existed well before this, but it didn't become as mainstream and popular as it was until the original Xbox. I mean, Halo was a cultural uprising. I remember it felt like there were more copies of Halo 2 in stores than there were actual Xboxes to play it on. And sure, some of you aren't big fans of online gaming, I get that, but remember, I'm not making an argument for which consoles are the best, I'm making an argument for which consoles made the biggest impact. And it's hard to deny how much it impacted the gaming landscape. Online console gaming is enormous now. Some kids today only play games online, and the idea of people playing games offline by themselves might even seem disgusting to them, like something that only old weirdos like you and me would do. But no, we're super cool. Come on, kids, playing these old games is awesome. Okay, but I gotta circle back to the argument that online gaming has actually ruined gaming in some ways. In fact, great opportunity to throw on my back in my day pants again and tell you how great multiplayer was with a group full of your buddies all in the same room to scream at the top of your lungs as somebody blasts you with a blue shell in Mario Kart 64. Don't worry, Dad, nobody's dead in here. But even if you feel like online gaming has ruined multiplayer gaming, I'd still argue that's part of the impact. How game developers design their games with online multiplayer in mind, and perhaps with single player not in mind at all, has changed gaming forever, whether everybody likes it or not. And Xbox Live played a huge part in getting that ball rolling. Xbox is also the first Xbox console, no matter what Microsoft would have you believe when they named their Xbox One, and no matter what the little neighbor kid down the street tries to say. I think I need some better sources. Regardless, I'd say that the mark of Microsoft entering the game console market counts for something, unless you wanted to count the MSX, I suppose. But either way, the original Xbox was a new beginning for Microsoft. Although I should say you could probably convince me pretty easily that the Xbox 360 had more to do with spreading the popularity of Xbox Live, but I still find myself leaning towards the original Xbox, and don't forget, brute force. At number 3 on my list, we have the Game Boy. Pretty simple reason for this one, handhelds have become a huge part of the gaming console market and always have been ever since the surge of popularity that came from the Game Boy. Sure, there were other handhelds that came before it, but again, we're talking about impact. The Game Boy popularized handhelds in a big way. I mean, the name Game Boy is practically synonymous with handheld gaming. There's still some moms out there today that would tell you, what's this? A Game Boy? What's this? A Game Boy? What's this? Pardon me, that's just one of my nanners. Nintendo has been pretty dominant in the handheld game console market ever since the Game Boy, with pretty much every single Nintendo handheld selling gangbusters, eventually leading to their hybrid console, the Switch, which, you guessed it, is also selling well in a gangbusters type of variety. Nintendo hasn't seen a heck of a lot of competition either. Tiger handheld fans, cry your hearts out, with perhaps the biggest exception being the PSP, which did excellent, but was still outsold right around 2-1 by the Nintendo DS. Now, where the conversation around the Game Boy starts to get weird is when you try to evaluate if its impact on popularizing handheld gaming had an influence on smartphone games, because even if you argued it did, most people don't consider the smartphone to be a game console. Kind of like how many people don't consider the PC to be a game console. Understandable, given both of them serve a primary purpose outside of gaming that could be argued is far more significant. But regardless of what your stance on cell phone games is, the Game Boy helped to popularize gaming on the go, allowing people all around the world who either hate interacting with other people or doing this with their time spent waiting for stuff to rejoice. The Game Boy had a pretty solid run too. It went strong pretty much all the way through the 90s, a decade where gaming as a whole evolved pretty fast. The Game Boy evolved pretty slowly, with a lot of people saying the Pocket and Color models, which came out in 96 and 98, were more like variations than different consoles altogether. Mom, what are these? Game Boys, see? I told ya. What's funny too is that the Game Boy was already considered kind of outdated when it first released in 1989, but talk about the little engine that could, or perhaps the gray brick that could. This thing was rugged and in it for the long haul. Not even a Gulf War bomb blast could stop this thing. Yep, one Game Boy famously survived and still works to this day. Remember when your mom told you not to leave your Game Boy in the hot car because it would break? Wrong. Well, actually, maybe she was right. I wouldn't leave this in the car. But hey, if you think surviving a Gulf War blast is impressive, that's nothing compared to the Game Boy surviving the port of Mortal Kombat it got. Now that was a bomb. Okay, for number 2 on my list, we've got the NES, or as it was called back in the day, Nintendo. Yeah, people were on a first-name basis with the console back then. For a lot of people, they'd put it as their number 1, but I just can't do that because as much as it had a huge impact in North America, it didn't have quite the same impact in other parts of the world. At least not as directly. But let's start with the impact it had in North America first. Okay, so in 1983, revenues for home video games peaked at roughly $3.2 billion and dropped in 1985 all the way down to 100 million. So basically just people buying stuff on clearance. Yeah, I'd say that's enough to earn itself a name like the video game crash of 1983. I've always found it funny that Japan has a different name for it though. Nah, it's actually referred to as the Atari shock. So anyways, along came Nintendo to save the day, who needed to cook up a plan to bring video game consoles back to North America, where there was a huge stigma against them, which seems like kind of a problem. How do you sell something if it can't appear to be what it actually is? Well, hey, I managed to convince my wife I'm not an idiot. In the case of Nintendo, all they had to do was just make it not look like a video game console, then call it an entertainment system instead. Problem solved. And thus, the Nintendo Entertainment System became wildly popular in North America, got the home video game console market back on track, and the rest is history. A history some feel would have been much different without it. Here's the thing, even outside of saving the game console market in North America, this console is also where a lot of gaming's biggest series found their footing or even got their start. Where would the world be without the Ice Climbers? Plus, even if it was just the North American market that was saved, that is still a really big market. And yeah, Europe was mostly preoccupied with computer games during the NES era, but I'd still say that the overwhelming success it found in North America helped pave the way for Nintendo to eventually become a video game mainstay in Europe for years to come. There's plenty of Nintendo fans there now, am I right? Not to mention in Japan, seeing as the company doing well on a more global scale could only serve to benefit the company overall. Yeah, love 'em or hate 'em, Nintendo has been a big part of gaming's history, and I'd argue that NES was their most important console. Alright, and now for the number one console on my list, which would be the PlayStation 1. I think a lot of people would probably choose the PlayStation 2 over it. And while I agree that the PlayStation 2 was important, I feel like most of what the PlayStation 2 did was just a continuation of what the PS1 had already started. For example, making the video game market far more mainstream, which yeah, things becoming more mainstream make some people want to barf, but it's hard to deny how large of an impact this made on gaming and what it would become. Plus, while consoles can change the culture within gaming, I'd argue no console changed the way video games fit into the world's overall culture more than the PS1 did. Kids growing up today may not realize just how much of a stigma there was against playing video games back in the day. Remember, this was a time when being a dork or a nerd was considered a bad thing, whereas now, if anything, it's cool. Dorks and nerds rule the world, some less than others. Video games were synonymous with dork and nerd culture, and seeing as not everyone wanted to be considered a dork or a nerd at the time, there was a natural tendency for some to lean away from video games and lean their fists into the faces of anybody perceived to be dorks or nerds. Oh yeah, kids would get whooped for far less back then. But then all of a sudden the PS1 came along and the kid whooping your butt at school would go home and play Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and maybe stop whooping your butt altogether. Maybe start doing their homework too? I don't know. The PS1 changed things. It was cool. It had games like Resident Evil, Metal Gear Solid, and Crash Bandicoot. Wait, how is that not kid-friendly? Yeah, the PlayStation 1 certainly had games for everybody, which many of us would probably argue the consoles that came before it did also, but the difference was how the PlayStation 1 branded itself. I mean, it was made by Sony. They were known for making stuff like Discmans and TVs, you know, cool electronics. In fact, helping to distance itself from the stigma of being a game console, the PlayStation could also play CDs, you know, like music CDs, which makes sense given it used CDs for games as well. Now, CDs were nothing new at the time. Heck, some of us had been using our consoles to jam out to George Michael for years by that point. In fact, consoles like PC Engine CD supported CDs 6 years before the PS1. Even still, the PS1 marked the point where CDs used for video games received widespread mainstream adoption, with none of the consoles that came before for it that supported CDs, reaching anywhere near the amount of commercial success that the PS1 would. This really opened things up for game developers too. The CD format allowed for a ton more data to be stored over cartridges, allowing for things like high quality audio and full motion video, and in ways that people enjoyed more than Sewer Shark, if you can believe it. Not to mention, CDs were far cheaper, which made things a lot easier for developers to get on board. Speaking of which, if the argument is that Atari wasn't strict enough with its quality control, and Nintendo was too strict with its quality control, then one could argue that Sony nailed it with the perfect balance on the PS1. Way to Goldilocks your way through that one, Sony. Did the PS1 have lots of turd games? Sure, but they seem to curate things enough for the consumer, as well as have enough good games to dilute the library to the point where gamers felt they could trust them. This formula for success would set Sony up nicely to have its consoles regularly sell over 100 million units and become a dominant mainstay in the industry. Okay, so as promised, I'm going to rank the Magnavox Odyssey at number 7, basically as an honorary mention for being the first. The Atari 2600 I would put at number 5 in front of the Genesis because it showed that video game consoles could be wildly popular, if managed properly, which unfortunately they did not, leading to the crash and a very important cautionary tale for everyone to follow. The Fairchild Channel F is another one I could see some people mentioning for introducing interchangeable game cartridges. But how would you rank the most important consoles? There's no way everyone is going to agree with my list, or any list for that matter. But which consoles of mine did you agree with, and which consoles would you add on to the list? As always, I would love to know, so leave your responses down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. Enemies talking about